When you view an InfoTex webinar or movie, you do so with 4 caveats. First, you are agreeing to the terms posted at the webpage listed on this slide. Second, our lawyers want you to know that what InfoTex presents is often time-dated or about new trends, regulations, or guidance, and therefore we cannot provide this material with any warranty whatsoever. Thirdly, material provided with InfoTex webinars and movies is copyrighted. You keep the copyright to material customized to your organization, but InfoTex reserves the right to use the material in other engagements and boilerplates. See our Transfer of Copyright Agreement at the webpage listed in the slide. Finally, those who view our webinars or movies may be added to an email mailing list. If you do not wish to receive notice of additional educational opportunities, please accept our apologies and please opt out at the webpage shown on the slide.
Hello, and welcome to this year's R7 presentation, the top 7 risks that small institutions at the board level should be aware of. My name is Adam Reynolds. I am the Senior Staff Auditor and Lead Non-Technical Auditor for InfoTex. I've been with the company about 8 years now, and took over the presentation of this material last year from Dan Hadaway. So thank you for joining us today. If you do have any questions or even comments about this presentation, we do love feedback, so please drop us a line and let us know. And as you can see here, we state to small institutions who are in compliance with the GLBA. I can't think of any of our clients who are not in compliance with GLBA at this point in time. It's been around a little while now, but if you're not in compliance with that, I would say that is the first risk you need to address before anything we talk about here today. And with that, let me also state that InfoTex is not a financial institution, but financial institutions, especially smaller, community-based institutions, are our main client base. And while we do come up with this list of top 7 risks, they really come from people like yourself, our clients, and other bankers who are concerned about information security. It also comes from conferences and workshops we attend over the year. So while all 7 risks may not pertain to your institution specifically, most of them will, and risk is subjective. What's risky for you may not be for other institutions. So if there are other risks you feel should be presented on this list, please let us know. But this list, hopefully, is at least a starting point to help you educate your board on the risks they face going into this new year. So first, let me state that banks have a lot to deal with when it comes to information security. I think we can all agree there. But we here at InfoTex see information security officers as superheroes, specifically cybersecurity superheroes. And that's because they do a lot of work. Keeping information safe is a full-time job, and sometimes it can be a thankless job. Besides when new policies or procedures come out, and besides regular awareness reminders and training, you always have to keep up on the new threats and risks. But if things are working correctly, your users aren't hearing about the constant scanning of your website by malicious actors. They're not hearing about the emails that are blocked. But when those controls stop working on such assets, that's when you hear about it. But if everything is working correctly and you're keeping up on all of those controls, all of those risks, making sure technology is safe and working correctly, a lot of times nobody hears about it. But your information security officer is doing that every day, a lot of times behind the scenes. But we can't forget about everyone else at the bank. Information security is a team effort. It's led by the ISO, but everybody from the board to your frontline staff, even to your customers, are involved with information security. And awareness is the first step to security. Being aware of the risks and understanding how to respond to them is really the name of the game. You need involvement from every level to get it right. And if you look at this picture, you'll notice Hacker Guy on the bottom right there. We'll talk about him a little bit later, but obviously he's one of the threats that we're trying to protect against. So let me reiterate that one more time. Information security is a team game, and everybody needs to be on board for it to succeed. So what I'm going to discuss today is the board's role in cybersecurity, the top 7 risks we see small community-based banks facing in 2023 so that the board can be aware of the risks, and then from the top down, help guide and understand how these risks fit in at your particular institution, and what questions the board should be asking to make sure your customers' information is protected. First, as mentioned, we're going to discuss the board's role in cybersecurity. So, starting with this graphic from 2021, you can see small financial institutions, according to the 2021 Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, accounted for a very small percentage of breaches in 2021. But do mind the fact that while we do like this graphic, we haven't found a better source of information yet, and these numbers, especially for the smaller institutions, may be underreported, but they are good for comparing against previous year's numbers. And what we saw in 2022, according to the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, is actually an uptick in breaches at small companies. Finance still accounted for less than 1%, but there was definitely an increase in reported numbers from last year. So while it is still small compared to overall numbers, it is increasing, but congratulations in general to smaller financial institutions. They've been managing information security risks pretty well. And so this is our annual movie meant to help information security officers of small community-based financial institutions present to their board on the risks at their specific institutions. But first, we need to answer why we're doing all of this. And why we're doing all of this, rules, regulations, laws, and such, of course, we need to be in compliance with a lot of different things. We need to make sure we are addressing the standard confidentiality, integrity, and availability risks of information security. We have legal, reputational, and other risks. But why we're doing this is because our customers give us information, and they're trusting us to protect that information. And so first, we want to go over the board's role in protecting that information. The good news is that you're bankers, and you're in the business of banking, and you're good at managing risks. And that's one reason I believe the small financial institutions accounted for less than 1% of the breaches during the middle of the pandemic and last year, when a lot of people were still learning how to work from their homes. And in the past, we've used the metaphor of a canary in a coal mine here. The idea that, we need indicators to let us know, when things are working properly, as well as when things could take a turn for the worse. So one thing that bird or our indicators give us is peace of mind, that things are working correctly. And the board sees this from a high level through various reports, such as audit and examination reports, reports on vendors, information security reports. The board is responsible for understanding these risks, and these reports and such provide insight into how those systems have been working in the past. But the board is also required to look forward, approve new policies as they're needed, review risk assessments for new or current projects, approve those technologies when the risk has been addressed, approve IT audit plans and cybersecurity risk appetite statements. And this is all required through guidance and law. But again, it all goes back to protecting customers and their information. And from the board's perspective, are we checking on those birds, on those indicators, such as reports and risk assessments? The board's primary role is really to make sure that we're really using that particular control. We're using that set of controls that we put into place. And so by asking questions to make sure that we are checking those birds or indicators, it is important, it's an important way that the board can help us manage those risks. And there's three areas that really, you can focus your questions on. One, were we ready for the audit or the examination? When the audit or examination report comes in, was your team ready for the audit? Did it look like they were just kind of making things up as they went, or did they have everything ready for the auditor or examiner? Audit readiness is also something we've learned over the years. As we watch organizations that do well versus organizations that don't in responding to a breach or information security general, a great indicator of overall information security practices is audit readiness. And it's really that simple. The organizations that don't have the breaches are the ones that are ready for their audits and examinations. Meanwhile, The reason they're ready for their audits is because awareness training was applied in all directions, not just at your users, which is part of the guidance, but we made sure that the management team understood what needed to go into being ready for the audit, which is all about technology risk management. And so awareness training is huge. If you're just doing one, awareness training event per year and you think, you're done, I just don't think that cuts it anymore. It's always a continuing process, even throughout the year. And then finally, are we managing our new risks? What questions can we ask? Usually when the board's brought into something, it's because there's probably a new risk we're going to have to manage. Even if they don't present it that way, if they say, hey, there's this new great technology or software, that we want to bring in, and it's not that expensive, the board could ask, it's not expensive from a cash perspective, but how much is it going to cost us in terms of everybody's time to manage that new risk? And back to the whole concept of the agenda, the best way to manage risk right is to first start by knowing what you're going to manage. And so what can make those canaries or indicators sick in 2023? That's what we're going to be talking about next. And with the board role out of the way, we can now discuss the top 7 risks going into 2023. And those would be attacks on users, again, really focusing on social engineering, talent risk or employee attrition, supply chain attacks, endpoint threats, supply chain issues, the malicious insider threat, and anticipated regulatory risk. Starting off with attacks on users, really focusing again on social engineering. And I don't feel I need to explain this, but of course social engineering is a form of manipulation that involves tricking people into revealing sensitive information or performing actions that can compromise security. We typically group attacks into 2 different categories, technical or non-technical. Technical really being the targeting of systems or software, usually through automated techniques, while non-technical typically focuses on social engineering and attacking the user. Our users are really our first line of defense when it comes to non-technical attacks. They will be the ones targeted by many different types of attacks. And we can see from this chart that in last year's Verizon report, 82% of breaches involved the human element. And that was typically through social engineering, but can also include stolen credentials and simple errors. And we can see here the web application attacks. There is the technical side with hacking there, but it also involved social engineering. And the second highest attack vector was email, which again goes back to people and users. The biggest attack vectors, as we can see, include people. And this just reinforces the fact that users will be targeted. Whether internal users, customers, or even vendors, users will be targeted. So let me review the most common attack types. Of course, there's phishing scams, really the most common social engineering tactic where attackers, of course, send emails or messages that appear to be from legitimate sources, such as from the bank or a trusted business partner. These messages often contain links or attachments that, when clicked, can download malware or steal sensitive information. There are also credential stuffing attacks. Credential stuffing is a technique where attackers use stolen usernames and passwords to gain access to other accounts. They can obtain these credentials through data breaches, phishing scams, or by purchasing them on the dark web. Once they have obtained valid credentials, they can use them to access the victim's bank account or other sensitive information. That's why password reuse, is really becoming a big issue. And of course, there's things like social media scams. Social media platforms are increasingly being used for social engineering attacks. The bad guys can create fake profiles that appear to be legitimate and use them to send messages or friend requests to bank employees or customers. And then once they have established a connection, they can use social engineering tactics to trick victims into revealing sensitive information or clicking on malicious links. And there's also the physical security side of this. The social engineering attacks don't always take place online. While most definitely less common, attackers can also use social engineering tactics to gain physical access to a bank's premise. For example, an attacker may pose as a repairman or delivery person and use that as an opportunity to gain access to sensitive information or install malware on the bank's computer systems. Social engineering attacks can also come from within the bank itself. An employee who is manipulated into revealing sensitive information or downloading malware can compromise the entire organization's security. These attacks can be challenging to detect because the perpetrator is already authorized to access the bank's system and data. So what can we do about it? Awareness. If you've seen one of our videos before, you've probably heard us say awareness is 9/11ths of the battle. And it's awareness that we need to start with. And that needs to be in every direction, starting from the board of directors down to everyone, including our users, vendors, and customers. Education is key, as well as being proactive. Institutions must take steps to educate their employees and customers about the risks of social engineering and implement strong cybersecurity measures to protect against those threats. By remaining vigilant and taking proactive measures, you reduce the risk of social engineering attacks and safeguard your customers' sensitive information. Talent risk, or employee attrition. Now, this is one it's very specific to institutions. It may not be that applicable to everybody watching, but is a threat we've been taking seriously, especially at smaller community-based institutions where, more often than not, you're working with limited resources and limited budgets. And oftentimes, IT personnel wear many different hats, and there are key employees who have been working at the bank for a long time who would be difficult to replace. The job market has changed a lot in the last couple of years. Not sure where it's headed myself, but keeping and attracting the right personnel isn't an easy job anymore. At Infotechs, we see IT personnel as superheroes because of all the work they do, keeping information safe. It's more than a full-time job, and many times it can feel like pushing a boulder up a hill. But this is, of course, an inherent risk anytime you have employees. Community-based banks may find it challenging to attract and retain top talent due to their smaller size and limited resources. Of course, larger banks and financial institutions may be able to offer higher salaries, better benefits, and more opportunities for career advancement, but depending on your area, this may or may not make it more difficult to attract and retain top talent. There's also the risk of successions, where key employees or leaders who are approaching retirement age without a suitable successor have not been identified. This could result in a leadership void where the banks face challenges in meeting customer needs and maintaining operations. Succession planning is crucial for community-based banks because the loss of key employees can be detrimental to the organization's success. However, many community-based banks do not have that formal of a succession plan in place, which can leave the institution vulnerable to talent risks, such as the sudden departure of key employees. It's also important to document job descriptions and responsibilities so that if a position needs to replace, you have a documented starting point for normal duties and responsibilities. Banks may also face talent risk due to skill gaps within the workforce. Technology is rapidly changing with financial institutions, and community-based banks may struggle to keep up with the latest advancements, which can lead to skill gaps within the workforce, making it difficult to implement new technologies and processes. Time management is also an important skill for IT personnel, as it's really your most valuable resource. Time must be effectively prioritized to address the top risks first. As there are so many risks out there, prioritization is key in managing them. So mitigating these talent risks, banks can take several steps, which would include formal succession plans, documenting job descriptions and responsibilities, investing in employee training and development, and implementing competitive compensation packages. By addressing these talent risks, community-based banks can better position themselves for success and continue to serve their communities effectively. Supply chain attacks. Banks rely on a complex network of vendors and suppliers to provide them with the products and services they need to operate effectively. However, this reliance on third parties can also make them vulnerable to supply chain attacks. A supply chain attack occurs when cybercriminals target a supplier or vendor to gain access to the organization's system or data. There have been a few notable attacks of this nature in the last few years, such as SolarWinds. That occurred in late 2020, and cybercriminals gained access to SolarWinds, a leading provider of network management software, and injected malware into its software updates. When SolarWinds customers installed the updates, the malware gave the criminals access to their systems and networks, including several U.S. government agencies and other organizations. Microsoft Exchange. In 2021, 4 zero-day vulnerabilities in Microsoft Exchange Server were actively exploited by state-sponsored threat groups and others to deploy backdoors and malware in widespread attacks. Kaseya. Kaseya VSA is a product commonly used by MSPs to manage their clients' IT environments, and that was used as part of a supply chain attack delivering ransomware to thousands of other organizations. Apache Log4j is a Java-based logging utility. A vulnerability enabled attackers to gain remote access to applications that used it. From there, attackers could also breach the underlying servers and networks, which means the Log4j attack could essentially create a wide-open door to entire IT environments. And this logging utility was used in a lot of other applications. So what are some of the risks? There are some pretty obvious ones, such as access to sensitive data. Supply chain attacks can give criminals access to sensitive data held by your bank, such as customer account information or financial records. That data could then be sold on the dark web or used to commit further fraud. Disruption of operations. Supply chain attacks can also disrupt the operations of community-based banks. For example, if a vendor that provides critical services or products is compromised, the bank may be unable to process transactions or access critical data. Damage to reputation. Supply chain attacks can damage the reputation of banks, as customers may lose confidence in their ability to protect their data. This can then, of course, lead to a loss of business and revenue. Legal and regulatory risks. Banks may also face legal and regulatory risks as a result of supply chain attacks. For example, if customer data is compromised, the bank may be liable for damages or fines under data protection laws. And then cost of remediation. Supply chain attacks can be costly to remediate, as banks may need to invest in new security measures, conduct forensics investigations, and replace compromised systems or software. So how can we address this? By knowing our vendor. I know that sounds simple, and at a high level it is, but there are 5 particular areas you need to drill down on, and we call those the 5 precepts. With these 5 precepts, you can know your vendor and be able to assess the risks they pose to your institution. Assurance. Does the vendor have robust security controls to protect their systems and network from supply chain attacks? This includes implementing multi-factor authentication where available, restricting access to critical systems and data based on need, and implementing security measures to detect and prevent malicious activity. Assurance is often reviewed in the form of a SOC 2 report. Contract. Banks should establish clear contractual obligations with their suppliers and partners regarding their security practices and requirements. This includes defining the security standards that the supplier must adhere to, the frequency and scope of security audits, and the consequences of non-compliance. Insurance. Hopefully not needed, but if there was an incident at the vendor, does their insurance cover a breach, and how? Financial. Looking into the short-term and long-term viability of the vendor based on their financials. And then incident response and business continuity plans on both sides, yours and the vendor's. Does the vendor have adequate incident response and business continuity plans to get through an incident? And do your plans address what would happen if the vendor is breached or cannot continue to provide their services? To mitigate the risks of supply chain attacks, banks can take several steps. This includes conducting due diligence on vendors and suppliers, implementing robust cybersecurity controls such as 2-factor authentication and encryption, and establishing incident response plans to quickly respond to and contain any potential attacks. Additionally, banks can also work with third-party providers to manage their cybersecurity risks and ensure that their suppliers and vendors are also taking adequate security measures. By taking proactive steps to the supply chain risks, banks can better protect their data, operations, and reputation from these risks. The next item is endpoint threats. As mentioned previously, in the Verizon report, 82% of breaches involved the human element. And what were those people using? Their devices. In case our employees do get tricked with social engineering, do our endpoints have the right controls to stop it? Our devices are no longer a castle protected by a moat. And what I mean by that is that our devices used to be confined to our own networks. We could keep them all inside, which offered much better protection. But now access to the outside world is much more important and much more common, and we can't keep all of our devices protected inside our own environments anymore. And devices now consist of course, our traditional endpoints or desktops, but also laptops, phones, tablets, and even watches sometimes these days. And most of the items from this list are mobile as well. So we need a good mobile device management platform to manage the risks of those devices. Of course, we also have the classic antivirus, but those have continued to evolve as well into things like more advanced endpoint detection and response, where the endpoint itself is responding to events. And of course, we want to ensure all of our devices are sending logs. That way we're collecting those logs, reporting on any issues, and monitoring those devices as well. Because just like our traditional endpoints, patch management and vulnerability management are key to keeping those mobile assets safe, as they are often connected to the outside world. And as always, test those systems. Test the remote wipe function of your mobile devices. Every now and then, go in and verify patches and security updates are being installed and reported correctly, because you don't want to find out a control isn't working until it's needed. A non-tested control is just a wish. It's not a control. Supply chain issues. Community banks, like any other business, are not immune to supply chain risks. Supply chain risks can be defined as any unexpected events, disruptions, or vulnerabilities that occur in the extended network of suppliers, contracts, or partners that support the bank's operations. There are a lot of things going on right now that are affecting various supply chains in the US and abroad. First, starting off with global instability. There's a lot going on. Russia and Ukraine, China, Taiwan, South Korea, sanctions, COVID, inflation, recession. And what all these things generally mean is that prices are going up and availability is going down. And this is especially true for IT equipment. We saw the impact of a chip shortage for car manufacturers, and there are many similar shortages that affected IT equipment in general. Supply availability. But what are the implications for you? As I just stated, costs and availability are not what they used to be, and you need to be aware of that. This will most likely affect IT projects you may be undertaking or planning to undertake, but you need to be aware that IT projects may take longer than expected and cost more than expected, so you have to plan for that ahead of time. Finding alternate vendors is also important. On our MSSP side, we had a large vendor we worked with for many years, but in the last 6 months, we can no longer rely on them for the hardware as we did before. And luckily, we identified alternate suppliers before we ran into that situation. But be aware, depending on the quantity of hardware you need, it may not be available in your planned timelines and the cost you would traditionally expect. So to fight this risk, it's really awareness and planning ahead. The malicious insider threat. Another risk is the malicious insider threat. And what's really frightening to me as an auditor is that this is becoming an important risk to manage. And the smaller the bank is, it seems the less they want to talk about it. And we understand why, but the board might need to make sure that we're at least becoming aware of how insider threats can materialize and how to respond to them. We trust each other, especially the smaller the bank, the more we trust each other. We've known each other for many years, but we'll talk about why trust is not a control. How many of us think about user mistakes or policy enforcement issues when we hear insider threat? Because that is most definitely included in the insider threat risks. And how many of us believe that the malicious insider threat is real? While it may never materialize at your institution, it's still a risk that needs planned for. So the insider threat can be intentional or not. Awareness and policy enforcement can help keep the unintentional threat curbed. But what about those with malicious intent? As we see from the Verizon report, internal actors were responsible for around 20% of the breaches, whether intentional or not. And one common thing is that there are always signs, precursors to the incident, which we can often find in logs of our network traffic. So making sure auditing and logging of users' activities is a must these days. And another commonality is that a lot of times when it happens, people don't expect it to. You can't say it will never happen at your institution, unfortunately. Hopefully it doesn't. But again, you can't rely on hope, and you need to be prepared. The FFIEC's guidance on this uses the term rogue employee, which implies that employees can turn rogue for many different reasons. That could be trouble at home, financial motivations, or even just being fed up at work. And all of these tie into likelihood. Typically, the insider threat likelihood is low, but the impact would be very high. And it can cause disruptions of service, affect data integrity, affect data confidentiality, and be used to commit fraud or extort the bank. But even if the likelihood is low, again, it's really one of our worst case scenarios. So what can we do about it? We place a lot of trust in our technology team. There's a lot they could do without our knowledge, so we trust them, but we should also be protecting them. And that would be through such things as separation of duties or segregation, limiting access based on job. These are just the start. We need to make sure we're monitoring and logging events as well. And we need to make sure we have a security culture. Is everybody on board, from the board to the frontline staff? Does your security culture encourage self-reporting? Would your employees be comfortable coming up to the information security officer and saying, I think I just clicked on a link? If they are, with that kind of culture, users are more apt to respond faster when there is a threat to information security. Conducting a threat analysis. That's important to determine where the insider threat falls in comparison to other threats. While again, likelihood is often perceived low and may be ranked lower than reality, the result is usually surprisingly high due to the elevated impact. Try redoing the threat analysis with the prerequisite statement of during a merger or during a layoff. How would that affect the insider threat risk analysis? And then make sure physical and fraud are on the incident response team. Develop an insider threat response scenario as part of your overall incident response plan. Make sure that any changes in response structure due to legal risks and other issues surrounding arresting a coworker are already built into the incident response process. Elevate to your SOC or MSSP when conditions increase the likelihood of an insider threat, which could be things like mergers, layoffs, malicious terminations, and other things of that nature. And then, of course, test your incident response scenario. Again, testing is key. You need to address action items that come out of the post-mortem review of that incident response. Add the continuous improvement of this process. Make sure the risks are identified in your threat analysis. And make sure this is all implemented in your overall IT governance program cycle. If you do any one of these steps, it should be testing. That's the way you can identify the gaps in your response to a malicious insider. Regulatory risks, or expected regulatory risks. As we move into 2023, community banks face an increasingly complex regulatory landscape. Changes in legislation and the introduction of new regulations are expected to impact banks significantly. The regulatory environment for cybersecurity continues to evolve rapidly. In 2023, community banks can expect new regulations aimed at strengthening their cybersecurity posture. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, and other regulatory bodies are expected to introduce new guidelines and standards for cybersecurity risk management, incident response, and data protection. Banks will need to implement these guidelines and ensure that they have robust cybersecurity programs in place to comply with the new regulations. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, is also expected to introduce new anti-money laundering laws and regulations in 2023. Those regulations would be aimed at preventing money laundering and terrorist financing by requiring financial institutions to implement enhanced due diligence, risk assessments, and transaction monitoring. Community banks will need to ensure that they have the necessary systems and processes in place to comply with these new regulations. The CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, is also expected to introduce new consumer protection regulations, focusing on preventing unfair, deceptive, and abusive practices by financial institutions. To prepare for these and other new regulatory risks, community banks should take the following steps. Staying informed. To stay informed about the latest regulatory developments and assess how they may impact your operations, monitor regulatory websites, attend industry conferences and workshops, and consult with legal and compliance experts. Conduct risk assessments. Conduct risk assessments to identify areas where they may be exposed to regulatory risk. They should assess your current policies and procedures, systems and processes, and employee training programs to ensure that they comply with the latest regulatory requirements. Updating policies and procedures. You need to update your policies and procedures to reflect the latest regulatory requirements. You should ensure that your policies are clear, concise, and easy to understand, and that they are communicated effectively to employees. And then implement training programs. Implementing training programs really to ensure that employees are aware of the latest regulatory requirements and they understand how to comply with them. These training programs should be ongoing and should include periodic updates as regulations change. Banks face an increasingly complex regulatory landscape coming into 2023. New regulations, again, are focused on cybersecurity, AML, consumer protections, and we also expect to see increased financial fintech regulations. By staying informed, conducting risk assessments, updating policies and procedures, and implementing training programs, you can prepare for these new regulatory risks and ensure that they remain compliant with the latest regulatory requirements. And finally, we move into the last section. With those 7 risks out of the way, to wrap this up, how can the board address these issues? But really, again, what it's all about is making sure that we're protecting our customers and their information. Are we checking those birds or indicators? We go into board meetings on a regular basis and present audit reports, and we present usually a scaled-down version of this webinar that you're watching today. And on a very regular basis, board members will pull us to the side, or they'll even bring up right in the meeting, because we're encouraging them to ask questions. And so they'll say, I have a question. Protecting our customers. Can you give us some bullet points or something on that? So how can the board make sure that we're protecting our customers? And you do that by asking questions. Questions about, those indicators, right? But there's 3 areas that you really could focus your questions on. A, were we ready for the audit? Or when the audit comes in, was our team ready for the audit? Did it look like they were just making it up as they went along? Or did they have everything in place ready for the auditors or examiners? Audit readiness, we've learned over the years, as we watch organizations that do well versus organizations that don't do well, it's really that simple. Organizations that don't have the breaches are the ones that are ready for their audits or examinations. Meanwhile, the reason they're ready for their audits is because awareness training was applied in all directions, not just at our users, which is part of guidance, but we made sure that management team understood what needed to go into being ready for the audit. The technical team, which is really all about technology risk management. And awareness training is huge. If you're just doing one awareness training event a year and you think you're done, it's really not going to cut it these days. You need to make sure awareness training is an ongoing effort. So what questions can we ask? Usually when the board's brought into something, it's because they're probably a new risk you're going to have to manage, even if they don't present it that way. If someone says, hey, there's a new cool, great software that we want to bring in and it's not that expensive, the board could ask, it's not that expensive from a cash perspective, but how much is it going to cost us in terms of everybody's time to manage that new risk? So back to the whole concept of this agenda. The best way to manage risk right is to first start off knowing what you're going to manage. So we need to make sure we have good controls that include self-reporting, user containment, and the acceptable use policy. That management is taking part in the incident response testing from an awareness perspective, and that we're including everyone, our users, management, technical team, vendors, and customers. So the questions to ask are, how prepared was our team for the audit or examination? Are we making sure the users are properly trained? Are we following through with incident response testing? What are we doing about customer education? And then finally, what are the new risks and what are we doing about them? With those questions, managing these new risks from the board perspective becomes a little easier. And with that, if you have any questions or comments, please let us know. But thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you do have any questions or comments, we'd love to hear feedback, so please let us know. Again, thanks for watching today, and have a great rest of your day.